The barren moon spun slowly beneath the stars. Its surface was gray, scarred with craters, and almost lifeless. No forests, no oceans, no air that could be breathed without a mask. Yet in the shadows of broken rocks, something still moved. A creature with silver fur lay on the ground, her sides rising and falling with slow breaths. She was large, more than twice the size of a lion, with sharp teeth and glowing eyes that once struck fear across galaxies. This was a star wolf. She was not alone. 3 small cubs huddled close to her, pressing against her body for warmth. Their fur was patchy, their cries weak. They were hungry, and their mother had no strength left to hunt. Her wounds were deep, burned by energy weapons. She had fought hard, but the fight was not fair. She had not lost to nature or to rivals. She had been abandoned. Above the moon, a ship moved away without a care. It belonged to the alien empire known across the stars for its cruelty. They had used the Star Wolf for experiments and tests, pushing her into battles she never chose. To them, she was nothing more than a tool. Now that she was injured, they had dropped her and her cubs on this moon to die slowly. It was cheaper than healing her. It was easier than giving her mercy. Far away in the same system, a human colony ship traveled on its route. Inside the control room, several crew members watched the scene on their screens. The ship had picked up the image of the alien vessel leaving orbit and scanned the surface below. That was when they found the wolf and her cubs. "Star Wolf," said one crew member in a low voice. Fear was clear in his tone. "Even wounded, they are dangerous. It is good the aliens left them there." Most of the others nodded in agreement. Everyone knew the history of these creatures. Star wolves had attacked colonies before, ripping through defenses with speed and strength. Whole squads of soldiers had been lost to them. Some said they were nature's perfect hunters, born to dominate. But one man did not look away from the screen. His name was Dan. He was not the strongest in the crew, nor the leader, but he carried a quiet stubbornness in his heart. As he watched the silver beast struggling to breathe, something stirred inside him. He saw not only a predator, but also a mother trying to keep her young alive. "She is dying," Dan said softly. "And the cubs will die with her." A woman at the console shook her head. "Better them than us. You know what those things can do. If she recovers, she will kill without thought. You want to risk that?" Dan did not answer right away. He leaned closer to the screen. The mother wolf's eyes were half closed, yet her body still curved protectively around her cubs. Even at the edge of death, she was ready to shield them. He thought of how humans once were, long before space travel, fighting to protect their families against odds. Was this really so different? "The aliens abandoned her," Dan said. "But we do not have to." The room fell silent. Some looked at him with disbelief, others with annoyance. One man laughed without humor. "Are you serious? Do you want to bring her onto this ship? She will tear us apart the moment she can stand." Dan shook his head. "I am not saying we bring her here. I am saying we should not just watch them starve." The leader of the crew, an older man named Paul, spoke at last. His voice was calm but firm. "We are not here to save beasts, Dan. We have a mission, and it does not include risking lives for creatures that would gladly eat us. Forget about it." Dan wanted to obey. He knew Paul was right about their mission. He knew the danger of these wolves. Yet as the ship moved on its path, he could not take his eyes from the screen. The cubs were pressing their small heads against their mother, and she was licking their fur weakly as if to comfort them. A thought grew in Dan's mind, heavy and restless. If they did nothing, no one would ever know or care. The wolves would die alone, another forgotten story in the vast galaxy. But he would know. He would remember that he watched life fade when he could have tried to stop it. That night, when most of the crew rested, Dan stood at the window of the ship and looked out at the stars. The moon where the wolves lay was now far behind them, but the image stayed sharp in his memory. He asked himself again and again why he cared. They were not human, they were not allies, and they were not harmless. But the answer that came back was simple. They were alive. They were fighting for survival, just as humans always had. Dan clenched his hands. He could feel a decision forming inside him, one that went against reason, against orders, but not against his heart. He did not know yet how he would act, but he knew one thing with certainty. He could not leave them to die without trying. The stars burned bright outside the window. Somewhere behind, on a cold moon, a mother wolf and her cubs still breathed, waiting for their final day. And Dan was not sure he could let that day come. The colony ship continued its steady path across the quiet stars, engines humming softly. Life inside carried on as usual. Crew members worked in the control room, checked systems, and followed their schedule without pause. For most of them, the wolves left behind on the barren moon were already forgotten. But Dan could not forget. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the silver wolf and her small cubs pressing against her weak body. He had seen death before in his years of service, but this was different. This was not battle, not fate, but choice. The aliens had chosen to abandon them. Now, Dan felt it was also his choice whether to act or to let them vanish. The next morning, during breakfast, Paul noticed Dan's silence. The older man set down his cup and asked in a calm voice, "Still thinking about the wolves?" Dan nodded slowly. "I cannot stop thinking. They will not last long." A woman across the table frowned. Her name was Myra, a skilled engineer. "You speak as if you want to save them." "Dan, they are not like us. Those creatures were made for war. Do you know how many colonies lost people because of star wolves?" Dan looked at her but did not argue. He knew she was right about their history, yet something in him refused to accept that as reason enough. He answered in a quiet tone, "They did not choose to be used by the aliens. They did not choose this end." Paul sighed. He was a man of duty, not cruelty, but his face showed the weariness of command. "Dan, our ship is carrying supplies for a new settlement. We have families depending on us. If we stop for them, we risk everything. What will happen if the mother wolf turns on us the moment she can walk? Will you answer to those families?" Dan did not reply. He only lowered his head. His heart fought against his mind, and the argument inside him did not end. Later that day, Dan went to the observation deck. From there he could see endless space, black and shining with countless stars. He pressed his hand against the glass and thought of Earth, the stories his grandmother used to tell him about wolves in the old forests. She had said they were proud hunters, but also loyal to their packs, never abandoning one another. That memory made the image of the star wolf sharper in his thoughts. Even hurt and weak, she had not abandoned her cubs. Dan whispered to himself, "If she has not given up on them, how can I?" A small voice startled him. "Talking to yourself again." It was Myra. She had followed him quietly. She leaned on the railing beside him and studied his face. After a pause, she said, "I know you, Dan. You will not let this go, will you?" Dan shook his head slowly. "I keep trying to forget, but I cannot. Something about this feels wrong. If we leave them, I will carry that weight." Myra sighed. "And what if you go back? What then? Do you plan to land on that moon with only a food pack and hope she thanks you instead of tearing you apart?" Dan smiled faintly, though his eyes were serious. "Maybe she will not understand. Maybe she will. But if I do nothing, I already know the ending. At least if I try, there is a chance." Myra looked at him, torn between worry and admiration. Finally, she said, "Paul will never allow this. You know that?" "I know," Dan answered. But some things must be done even if no one allows them. The next day, the crew gathered in the control room for routine checks. Dan stood among them, silent as they read out numbers and updates. When the meeting ended, he approached Paul. "I want to request a small shuttle," Dan said plainly. Paul stared at him, already guessing. "You cannot be serious." "I am," Dan replied. "Give me one shuttle, some rations, and I will go alone. I will not put the crew in danger. If anything happens, it will be only on me." The room grew quiet. Myra's eyes widened, and others whispered among themselves. Paul's face hardened. "Dan, I will not approve suicide. Do you hear me? You are part of this crew. Your life is not yours to throw away. You want to feed a beast that would rip you in half the moment she can stand. That is not bravery. That is madness." Dan's voice did not rise, but his words carried weight. "Maybe. But humanity is more than numbers and missions. If we only think of ourselves, we are no better than the aliens who left her there. I would rather risk my life doing what feels human than live knowing I turned away." The silence stretched long after his words. Paul finally turned his back and muttered, "I cannot stop you if you steal a shuttle. But do not expect my blessing." Dan nodded once, understanding. He left the room without another word. That night, as the ship's lights dimmed, Dan walked quietly to the hangar. The small shuttle stood ready, its engines asleep. His hands shook as he touched the controls, but his heart felt steady. For better or worse, his decision was made. As the shuttle doors closed behind him, he thought once more of the silver wolf lying weak on the barren moon. Somewhere out there, her cubs were still alive, waiting. And Dan was on his way. The small shuttle drifted silently away from the colony ship. Dan sat at the controls, his eyes fixed on the moon ahead. His heart pounded in his chest, but his hands stayed firm. The barren surface drew closer, gray and harsh under the light of the nearby star. He wondered if he was a fool, but it was too late to turn back. When the shuttle touched down, a cloud of dust rose and fell back to the ground. Dan checked his gear: oxygen mask, food packs, water, and a medical kit. He strapped on his belt and opened the hatch. Cold air rushed in, thin and biting, but his suit held firm. The land was silent. Only the crunch of his boots broke the stillness as he moved across the rocky ground. His scanner showed a faint heat source not far away. It had to be them. Step by step, Dan climbed a ridge and looked down into a shallow crater. There they were. The silver star wolf lay stretched across the stone, her sides rising with effort. Her 3 cubs pressed against her belly, whining softly. Her fur looked dull, burned in places, and her eyes were half shut. The moment Dan appeared, her head lifted. A low growl rumbled from her throat. Her glowing eyes locked on him, sharp even in her weakness. Dan froze. His breath came slow, and he raised his hands to show he carried no weapon. "Easy," he whispered, though he knew she could not understand his words. "I am not here to harm you." The wolf's growl deepened. She struggled to her feet, her body swaying with pain. She stood between him and the cubs, baring her teeth. Even in this state, she was terrifying. Dan slowly reached into his pack and pulled out a sealed container of water. He placed it on the ground in front of him, then stepped back. The wolf's eyes followed every move. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then one of the cubs, too curious and too thirsty, crept forward. The mother barked sharply, blocking him with her body. She did not trust the gift. Dan opened another pack, this time pulling out a strip of dried protein. He broke it and tossed a piece gently onto the ground, far from himself but closer to her. The scent carried on the thin air. The cubs whimpered again, hungry, but the mother only stared at him, muscles tense. Dan did not move closer. He simply lowered himself onto one knee and sat still. His heart raced, but he kept his body calm. He knew trust could not be forced. Minutes passed. Finally, the wolf lowered her head to sniff the food. She did not eat it, but her cubs rushed forward when she stepped aside. They tore into it quickly, their small teeth clicking against the dry ration. The mother watched them, then looked back at Dan. Something in her gaze changed. It was no longer only rage. It was also suspicion mixed with a faint spark of wonder. Why would this strange human feed them when her own kind had left her to die? Dan stayed silent, letting the scene unfold. He opened another container of water, pouring a little onto the ground where it pooled in the cracks of the rock. The cubs lapped at it eagerly. The mother finally crouched, licking the edge of the water with slow, careful motions. Dan let out a breath he had been holding. "That is right," he whispered, though his words were more for himself. "I am not your enemy." The wolf raised her head again, eyes glowing in the dim light. She still stood between him and the cubs, but the growl was gone. Instead, she studied him as if trying to decide what he was. Predator, prey, or something else entirely. Dan knew this was only the first step. She could still strike him down in a flash if she chose. But the fact that she had allowed him to approach, the fact that she had let her cubs take food from him, meant something had shifted. He slowly stood and stepped back, giving her space. "I will return," he said softly. "With more." As he climbed back toward the shuttle, he felt her eyes on him the whole way. Not once did she relax her guard, yet not once did she attack. When Dan returned to the shuttle and sealed the hatch, his hands trembled. He leaned against the wall, breathing hard. He had stood only a few steps from one of the deadliest predators known to the galaxy, and he was still alive. More than alive, he had made contact. He stared out at the gray surface. The mother wolf and her cubs were still there, clinging to survival. For the first time, he believed there was a chance. Back in orbit, the colony ship continued its path. The crew did not yet know what Dan had done. But down on the moon, a fragile thread had been tied between man and beast. And that thread, though thin, was strong enough to change everything. The moon's surface had become a second home to Dan. Each day he returned from his shuttle with food and water, leaving them carefully within reach of the star wolf and her cubs. At first, the mother never let him close. She would growl low in her throat and bare her teeth whenever he stepped too near. But over time, her growl softened, and her stance changed. She no longer saw him as an intruder. She saw him as something different, though she did not yet know what. The cubs changed faster than their mother. At first, they had hidden behind her, peeking out with glowing eyes. Now, whenever Dan arrived, they rushed forward with little cries, eager for food. They sniffed his boots and circled him with growing boldness. Their fur had filled in, and their steps were steadier each day. Dan kept his movements slow and calm. He remembered his grandmother's words about earth wolves: never show fear, never make sudden gestures, and always respect their space. He treated the star wolf the same. When the cubs grew too bold, the mother barked to call them back. She still placed herself between them and the human, but her body no longer trembled with rage. One day, Dan decided to test the line of trust. He took a small container of meat from his pack, crouched low, and held it out. The cubs yipped excitedly, pulling at their mother's fur as if begging her to let them take it. She watched Dan with sharp eyes. Minutes stretched into silence. Then she stepped forward, slow and deliberate. Dan's breath caught. She moved with her head low, her teeth half bared. But instead of striking, she sniffed at the container. Her hot breath fogged the inside of his visor. She locked eyes with him, a stare so intense it felt as if she searched his soul. Then, with a swift motion, she snatched the meat from his hand. Dan froze, waiting. The wolf stepped back, tore the meat, and let her cubs feed. For the first time, she had taken food directly from him. A small smile touched his lips. It was not trust yet, but it was no longer hatred. Days passed. The barren moon grew familiar, the ridges, the craters, the caves where the wind whistled. Dan spent hours near the wolves, sometimes sitting quietly as they rested. The cubs grew playful, tumbling over each other, their sharp cries echoing. Once, one of them nudged his arm with a wet nose before running back to its siblings. The mother barked sharply, but she did not attack. At night, when Dan returned to his shuttle, he wrote in his log. His words were simple, but full of wonder. They are not what we thought. Yes, they are fierce, but there is more. She protects her young the way we protect ours. She knows I am not her kind, yet she allows me near. Something is changing between us. But not everyone shared his hope. Back on the colony ship, Myra contacted him through the comm link. Dan, you cannot stay down there forever. The others are talking. They say you have lost your mind. Paul wants you back. Dan shook his head, though she could not see. I cannot leave them, Myra. Not yet. They are stronger now, but they are still not ready. If the aliens return, they will not survive alone. Her voice carried worry. And if she turns on you? What then? Dan glanced out the shuttle window. The mother wolf was lying outside, her cubs curled against her side. The stars glowed above them like cold lanterns. Then at least I will know I tried, he said softly. The next day, a storm swept across the moon. Harsh winds roared, carrying sharp dust that cut against exposed metal and rock. The wolves had no shelter strong enough to shield them. Their small cave rattled, stones falling from above. Dan rushed to help. He hauled metal panels from his shuttle and carried them across the storm. Dust stung his suit, and every step felt like walking against a wall. The wolf barked at him as he approached, unsure of his intent. But when he dragged the panels across the cave entrance to block the worst of the wind, she understood. Together, though not truly side by side, they endured the storm. Dan held the panels in place until his arms ached. The wolf stood at the entrance, shielding her cubs. Hours passed before the winds finally faded. When it ended, Dan slumped against the rock, exhausted. The mother wolf stepped closer than she ever had before. She sniffed his arm, then his helmet. Her glowing eyes lingered on him. For a moment, Dan thought she might strike. Instead, she lowered her head in something almost like a nod before turning back to her cubs. Dan let out a long breath. That small gesture meant more to him than words. It was not friendship yet, but it was respect. That night, as he wrote in his log, he realized something important. This was no longer just about saving them. It was about proving that two different kinds of life could meet without fear. That even in a galaxy ruled by cruelty, there could be trust. And deep down, Dan knew this was only the beginning. The moon was quiet again after the storm. Dan had grown used to the silence. Each day he spent among the Star Wolf and her cubs, the more he felt a bond forming. The cubs no longer feared him. They barked playfully when he arrived, their tails wagging as they circled his boots. The mother wolf still guarded them, but her eyes no longer burned with rage. She watched him with caution, but also with something like recognition. Dan felt proud of their progress. He believed the hardest part was behind them. But the galaxy was never so kind. Far above the moon, in the darkness of space, a patrol ship of the alien empire entered orbit. Its sensors had detected activity on the surface. The Empire had not forgotten about their failed experiment. They had come to erase it. The first sign Dan noticed was a sudden tremor under his boots. The wolves lifted their heads sharply, ears twitching. A low hum filled the air, unnatural and steady. Dan looked to the sky and saw the dark outline of a ship moving through the clouds of dust. His stomach sank. He tapped his comm device. Myra, he said quickly, they are here. The aliens have returned. Her voice came back full of alarm. Dan, get out of there. You cannot fight them alone. Dan looked at the wolves. The cubs were whining, pressing against their mother. The star wolf stood tall, fur bristling, teeth bared at the sky. She knew danger as well as he did. I cannot leave them, Dan answered. His voice was steady, though his heart pounded. If they came to finish this, I have to stay. The alien patrol ship lowered toward the surface. Its lights cut across the gray rocks like knives. A loud voice echoed through speakers in a strange alien tongue. Dan did not understand the words, but he knew the meaning well enough. It was a warning. A final judgment. The wolf snarled at the sound. Her cubs yipped in fear, but she did not back down. She planted her paws firmly on the ground, ready to defend them with her last breath. Dan grabbed his pack and pulled out his rifle. He had not wanted to use it, but now there was no choice. He ran to the ridge and crouched low, watching as the alien ship's doors opened. Figures stepped out, tall and armored, carrying glowing weapons. There were 4 of them, moving in formation. Their helmets shone in the pale light, their steps heavy against the stone. They walked without hesitation toward the crater where the wolves waited. Dan shouted into his comm Myra, tell Paul the first need support. If we do nothing, they will slaughter them. There was silence for a moment, then Myra's voice returned, sharp with urgency. Hold on, Dan. I will talk to him. Just stay alive. Dan gritted his teeth. Staying alive would not be easy. The aliens moved closer, weapons raised. The mother wolf let out a roar that shook the air, leaping forward to block their path. She was still weak, but her spirit was unbroken. The aliens fired. Bright bolts cut across the crater, striking the rocks around her. She dodged one, but another clipped her side. She staggered, growling in pain, but did not fall. No, Dan muttered. He raised his rifle and fired. His shots hit the ground near the aliens, forcing them to spread apart. They turned their attention to him, weapons swinging his way. Dan dove behind a boulder as blasts tore into the stone. Dust filled the air. He peeked over the edge and fired again, keeping them from advancing too quickly. The wolf took her chance. With a sudden burst of strength, she lunged at one of the aliens, knocking him off his feet. Her teeth sank into his arm, tearing through metal and flesh. The alien screamed, dropping his weapon. The others fired at her, but Dan shot at them from the ridge, drawing their attention. One of his shots hit a soldier in the chest, sending him crashing to the ground. 2 remained, advancing fast. The cubs cried loudly from the crater, but the mother ignored them, locked in a savage struggle with the alien beneath her. Dan kept firing, but his rifle hummed with overheating. He knew it would not last. Myra, he shouted into his comm, where are you? Her voice came back at last. We are coming. Hold on. Paul gave the order. We are armed and on our way. Relief surged through Dan, but he knew he still had to survive until they arrived. The 2 aliens pressed forward, their weapons glowing brighter. Dan ducked back as blasts exploded near his cover. His ears rang, his chest ached, but he held his ground. The mother wolf finally tore down her enemy and spun toward the others, blood staining her silver fur. She roared again, standing shoulder to shoulder with Dan, though they were still several steps apart. Their eyes met for a brief moment. No words were spoken, but the message was clear. They were not fighting alone. The aliens regrouped, circling carefully. The patrol ship above shifted, preparing to fire its cannons. Dan's heart sank. A single blast from that ship would end it all. Then, streaks of light flashed across the sky. The colony ship descended, weapons blazing. Explosions lit the air as the patrol ship was forced to pull back. Human fire rained down on the aliens below, scattering them in confusion. Dan rose from his cover, firing alongside the wolf. Together they drove the remaining soldiers back toward their shuttle. The cubs cried out but remained safe behind the rocks. When the last alien fell, silence returned to the crater. Dan lowered his rifle, breathing hard. The wolf stood beside him, chest heaving, her glowing eyes fixed on the sky where the enemy ship retreated. For the first time, she did not growl at him. Instead, she gave a slow, steady look. A silent promise. They had fought as one. And in that moment, something unbreakable was forged. The dust from the battle still hung in the air as Dan knelt beside the wolf. The mother's fur was torn, and her sides were streaked with blood, but her eyes glowed with a fierce pride. Her cubs huddled behind her, trembling but alive. Dan looked up toward the sky, where the retreating alien ship disappeared into the darkness. Relief surged through him, but he knew this was only the beginning. The aliens would return if they could, stronger and more determined. He needed help, and the humans aboard the colony ship were the only ones who could provide it. He activated his COMM Myra. "Paul," he said, his voice steady despite exhaustion. "We cannot leave it to chance. They will come back. I need your help to protect them and us." There was silence at first. Then Myra's voice, tense but firm, answered. "We cannot just step into that crater, Dan. They are dangerous. The Star Wolf is dangerous. And the aliens will shoot at us the moment we show ourselves." "I know," Dan replied. "But if we do nothing, they will die, and the aliens will consider this a victory. We can fight together, humans and wolves. We can survive if we act smart and fast." Paul's voice came over the comm, gruff and sharp. "Dan, this is reckless. You're asking us to risk the entire colony ship for creatures we cannot control. You know the rules. You know the dangers." Dan did not hesitate. "I am asking because it is the right thing to do. If we leave them, what makes us different from the aliens? If we fight, we show what humanity can be: strong, brave, and merciful." A long silence followed. Myra exhaled. "He is right," she said finally. "If we do not help, we fail ourselves. We cannot let fear make the choice for us." Paul's tone softened slightly. "Fine. We will act. But you must coordinate with us. One mistake and we all die." Dan nodded. "Understood." Within hours, the colony ship descended toward the moon. The shuttle Dan had used was reinforced with additional shields, and several crew members armed themselves with energy rifles. They moved carefully, avoiding the largest craters and staying hidden as long as possible. On the surface, the wolf sensed their arrival. She growled, low and warning, circling her cubs as she scanned the horizon. She did not know these humans, except for Dan, but she sensed his determination. He had fought beside her. He had risked his life. And now, more humans were coming to stand with him. Dan signaled to them from the ridge. "Stay low. Follow my lead. Move fast and keep your weapons ready." The humans advanced cautiously. When they were close enough, Dan fired a small flare into the sky. The wolf barked sharply and leapt toward him. He caught her mid-motion with a calm, steady hand, keeping her from attacking the newcomers. She froze, uncertain. Dan whispered to her, his voice soft and confident. "They are here to help. I will not let them harm you. Trust me." The wolf hesitated. Her body tensed, ready to flee or fight. Then, slowly, she relaxed and returned to her cubs. She allowed the humans to approach, their rifles raised but not aimed at her. Together, they formed a circle around the cubs. The humans and the wolf were no longer enemies. They were allies. Suddenly, a shadow passed over the crater. Another alien patrol ship descended rapidly, this one larger and armed with heavy cannons. Dan's heart leapt. There was no time to hide. The humans and the wolf prepared for battle. The first alien soldier fired. Dan returned fire, aiming carefully, while Myra took cover behind a boulder and provided support. The mother wolf leapt at the nearest alien, knocking him to the ground with a swift and powerful strike. The cubs squealed, pressed against their mother, but they did not run. The humans coordinated quickly. Shots fired in unison, forcing the aliens to scatter. The wolf moved among them, dodging energy blasts and biting at any who came too close. Dan ran alongside her, keeping their enemies distracted. The aliens tried to regroup, but the humans were ready. They had learned to move in sync with the wolf, taking advantage of her speed and strength. Each time one enemy soldier advanced, the wolf blocked him. Each time Dan fired, another was pushed back. Finally, the alien patrol ship above fired a warning beam. Dan looked at Myra. "We have one chance. We cannot let them call for reinforcements." Myra nodded. "Then we end this now." The humans advanced in formation, with Dan at the lead and the wolf beside him. The cubs watched safely from behind a rock as their mother fought with relentless energy. One by one, the alien soldiers fell or retreated toward their shuttle. When the last soldier fled, the humans and the wolf stood victorious. The patrol ship hovered for a moment, then retreated into space. Dan lowered his rifle, breathing hard. The mother wolf stood beside him, tall and proud. She turned her glowing eyes toward him. For a moment, no words were needed. The respect between them was clear. The cubs ran to their mother, pressing against her legs. Dan smiled as he watched them. They were safe. For now, the wolf and her cubs were alive, and humanity had chosen to protect life rather than ignore it. In the quiet that followed, Dan knew this was more than a battle won. It was proof that humans could be more than survivors. They could be protectors. And in that choice, they had shown the galaxy what humanity truly meant. The battle was over, but the moon remained quiet. Dust still floated in the air, settling on the rocks and the crater where the star wolf and her cubs had survived against all odds. Dan knelt beside the mother, examining her wounds. Her fur was scorched, and her side was cut, but she breathed steadily. The cubs were huddled together, alert and curious, yet no longer frightened. Dan touched the mother gently. "You are safe now," he said softly. The wolf's glowing eyes met his. There was no growl, no aggression. Only trust. For the first time, she allowed him to stand near her and her cubs without hesitation. The humans were gathering supplies. They had landed temporary shelters, rations, and medical kits. Myra and Paul worked with Dan to create a secure space for the wolf and her young. The colony ship remained in orbit, scanning for any return of the alien empire. All around, humans moved carefully, learning the ways of a predator that had once been their enemy. The mother wolf observed everything with sharp eyes. She did not rush her trust. Every movement of the humans was measured, and she watched for weakness or deceit. But she saw none. Dan had risked his life repeatedly, not for power, not for orders, but simply because he believed it was the right thing to do. That truth carried weight even for a creature that had learned to fear all outsiders. The cubs began to play again. Their small legs carried them across the rocks, tumbling over one another, nipping lightly at each other's ears. The mother occasionally barked a warning, but it was not harsh. Dan chuckled quietly, watching them, and realized that in many ways, the cubs had already learned to trust him too. Days passed, and the temporary shelters became more permanent. Dan and his team built small enclosures for the wolf and cubs, providing protection from harsh winds and minor threats. The star wolf adapted quickly, pacing the space, exploring cautiously but confidently. The cubs followed her lead, learning from their mother and the humans simultaneously. One evening, Dan stood on a ridge overlooking the moon. The stars stretched infinitely above, and he could see the colony ship far above, its lights like distant fireflies. He thought about the choice he had made when he first saw the wolf and her cubs. Most humans would have left them to die. Most humans would have obeyed orders without question. But he had chosen differently. A sound behind him made him turn. The mother wolf approached, her gait steady, her eyes glowing softly. She stopped a few feet away and lowered her head slightly. Dan understood the gesture. It was a sign of respect, recognition, and perhaps gratitude. In that moment, human and wolf shared an understanding deeper than words. The cubs came running, their small bodies bumping into him playfully. Dan laughed. "You are growing fast," he said. "And strong too. You will survive, I promise." Paul approached from the human camp, nodding toward the wolf. "I never thought I would see the day when humans and star wolves could stand together." "You were right, Dan. Trust can change everything." Dan smiled but said nothing. Words were not needed. He looked at the mother wolf and her cubs, seeing the bond that had formed through danger, care, and courage. The galaxy was vast, filled with cruelty and challenges, but here, on this small moon, something remarkable had happened. The colony ship sent a message to nearby settlements, telling the story of the wolf and her cubs, of a human who chose mercy over fear, and of how the humans and wolves had fought together. Across the stars, the story spread. Humans were not just survivors. They were protectors. They could extend compassion even to creatures that others would have destroyed without thought. The star wolf did not leave. She stood near Dan and the shelters, her cubs at her side. She had tasted humanity's mercy and strength. In return, she offered loyalty and protection. Together, they formed a small family that crossed the boundaries of species. As the days passed, Dan often thought about the lessons he had learned. Fear could paralyze, but courage could unite. Mercy could be risky, but it could forge bonds stronger than steel. And even the smallest choice, a second thought about life, could ripple across worlds. The moon, once barren and lifeless, now held life and hope. The mother wolf watched her cubs play, glancing at Dan occasionally as if to say she understood. They had survived the cruelty of the alien empire. They had survived fear. And they had survived because humanity chose to act with heart. Dan stood silently on the ridge, watching the stars. Somewhere far away, the galaxy moved as always, with battles and empires, danger and ambition. But here, in this quiet place, humans had shown what they could be. Protectors. Friends. Allies to life itself. And the star wolf, once abandoned and left to die, would never forget it.